Hey guys, so in this video I want to try to answer a question that I've been asked a few different ways over the years, which is how do I know where to put the highlights? It sounds like such a simple question, and what I've learned over the last couple of weeks researching this video is it's not a very simple question. And there's a reason why a lot of tutorials tend to sort of scamper over some of this stuff. And so tell me if this has happened to you. So you're going to watch this tutorial on rendering. Now rendering is just adding light and shadow. It's a fancy word for that. So rendering, you're going to learn how to render in this tutorial. And then the artist does something like this. They go, well, the light's coming from the right, obviously. So we're going to start by lighting this character on the right side. Something like this, I believe, would be appropriate. Yes, I think this does it. And maybe we put a bounce light on the other side, and you'll notice that I'm not even looking at the canvas as I work on this because that's how easy it is. So I've exaggerated a little bit. But think about that for a second. You're asking, where do the highlights go? And you're being told they go on the side with the highlights, right? So you're thinking, well, there must be something wrong with me. I'm missing something, right? So you think, okay, well, I need some fundamentals. I need to learn some more basics. I'm not ready for this yet. So you find the basics tutorials, and most of them look something like this, with spheres and cones and cylinders and cubes and all that stuff. And that stuff's great. Like, you really do need to understand how lighting works on those objects because they make up the basic forms of just about everything. But I think there's a couple of issues with those. And this is not a knock against any of these tutorials because they're super important. But for some people, I think they're a little too abstract. Like, it's so far removed from what you actually want to color that they're not as helpful as you would like them to be. I've had some of the same feelings myself at different points or for different things. So what I want to try to do with this video, probably this series, is to try to bridge that gap between these shapes and being able to color the things that you want to color. And by the way, I want to thank Adam Archer and Iron Cross Publishing for allowing me to use this character. So if where do the highlights go is a question that you have asked, then stay tuned. All right, welcome everyone. My name is K. Michael Russell, and if you're new here, I am a comic book colorist, and I teach coloring here on my YouTube channel. And even though my channel normally focuses on color for comics, honestly, this sort of stuff, light and shadow, this is basic enough that this would apply to almost any type of art that you're making. So just because you're not making sequential art for comics doesn't mean this stuff doesn't apply to YouTube. So for this first example, we'll take our buddy the sphere here, and this is not a circle, this is a sphere. I added little mesh lines in here to show you guys this is a sphere. We have a light over here to the right, so it makes sense the side facing the light is lit, half of the sphere is lit, and half of it's not lit. Now this thing in the middle, this little line right across the middle, that's called the terminator. Yes, just like the Schwarzenegger movie Terminator. And I'm guessing it's called Terminator because that's where the light terminates. I don't know. It doesn't really matter, it's just a term. So one half of the sphere is lit and one half is not lit. And there's really two things that I want to get across in this first little section, is that the parts that we see that are lit will change depending, of course, on the position of the light bulb, but also our position and where the quote-unquote where the camera is. So if we were to look at this from a top-down view, it would look something like this. So we're standing here. Okay, we're looking straight down. This guy has a massive head, by the way. And he's standing in front of this sphere, and the light bulb is over here to the right. Okay, makes sense, right? Now, if we were to move this light bulb closer to us, like this, then obviously the terminator is going to move, and how much light that we see is going to move, because now that the light is very close to us, then we can see more of what the light can reach and less of what it can't. And the same thing applies in the other direction as well. If we move the light away from us, then obviously we're seeing more of the shadow side. And this is this part that I don't think people get confused about. I know that it's how to execute this, but bear with me for now. Now the second thing that's going to alter how the light appears on whatever you're coloring is where the camera is. That's going to make a difference. And when I say camera, I just mean the viewer's eye, the position that we're looking at the art end, basically, if that makes sense. And so if we were to, let's take our little top-down figure over here. If we were to take this guy and move him, let's move him over here by this light so that he's really close to the light, and now he's looking at our sphere again. What is it going to look like? It's actually going to look just like this, same as before, except this time the camera's moving instead of the light. So as we're closer to the light, we can now see more of this face of the sphere. Now the same thing would apply if we were to take our gentleman, turn him around over here, so that he's really close to the sphere, and the light bulb is now further away. Because his perception is changing, because we've changed the angle, let's move this out of the way, we're going to see something like this. So again, in both of these cases, because the sphere is identical in all directions, whether we move the light or we move the camera, the results are the same. But the point that I want you guys to understand is that, number one, of course it matters where your light source is, but number two, it matters where your camera is, or where your view of the scene is. Now, one thing that might help you sort of visualize how this Terminator works and where it goes is it's always going to be, with a sphere, it's going to be at a right angle, it's going to be perpendicular to your light. So as the light's coming in like this is a right angle, okay? And a right angle is just a 90-degree angle. It's a hard right turn to do this, okay? So that's what perpendicular means. So as the lights come in, this Terminator forms a 90-degree angle right here, if you remember your geometry. And even when the angle changes, in reality, this is still a right angle because the light's coming in. And if you think about this ring that goes all the way around, we can't see this side. But if you think about that little ring kind of forming a disc, that's sort of like a target right down the center of that sphere here. Same thing would apply on the other side, except we wouldn't really see the front. We'd be looking at the back side of our target. So if you were to cut that sphere right down the middle and place a target there, then that's still a right angle, okay? So let's say that we have a row of stick figures with spheres for heads. They're standing out in the middle of a green field with blue sky and a bright sun, okay? Now, the sun's rays are always parallel, okay? They're coming from the sun a long, long way away, and they always come in straight lines. But when we add perspective, those things can change. So I think it'll make more sense to look at this from the top first. So let's imagine for a second we've got our stick figures and we're way, way up in the air, and we've got a drone and we're zoomed up, and this is what we're seeing. So when you think about that light and it's coming in, again, it's coming in parallel. We know it's coming in parallel from the sun. So we're going to get something sort of like this, right? Now at this angle, if we take our little target analogy, it would kind of be a disc. So again, I'm kind of tracing the outline of that Terminator. So this is going to be the center of the target, and the sun's rays are all coming in like this. But again, because it's a sphere, one side is lit, one side isn't. Don't worry about the transition yet. We're going to cover that later. So let's go back to the position we were before, which is here. Now, the sun rays are still parallel, but our perspective has changed. It's moved. If we look at our example here, let's say that we're standing on this red X right here, okay? So we're right behind these guys, and these guys are kind of off at an angle, okay? So we're actually looking at all of these guys at different angles relative to where the sun's coming in. So if we're standing here, even though these light rays are perfectly parallel, the angle we have on each one is different. So we're going to get something like this. Now this is a rough example. I haven't measured this out to the nth degree or anything, but we're going to see very little light on these guys that are right in front of us. And that makes sense if you think about it, because we're right behind them and the sun's on the other side, so we're just going to get a little bit of sun right up here. Same thing with this guy next to him, just a little bit, but also because the sun's over here to the right, you'll notice that this is shifted a little bit to our right as well than this guy, which we're pretty much standing right behind. And as we go further, again, our perception is changing. We're seeing more of the left or the right side of this guy's head, so we're seeing more of the light. And even as we move to the guy on the end, we've got our light ray coming in, our disc is kind of getting squashed like this where the Terminator is, so we're seeing more of the right side of this guy's head. And the same thing applies on the other side. As we go around this way, we're just seeing a little bit here, but as we keep going, we're seeing more of the left side of this guy's head. But really the point that I want you to take away from this is that your lighting is going to change depending, of course, on the position of the light and where the camera is, or where the viewer's eye is. And hopefully this makes sense. If it doesn't, leave a comment. So not all light sources are the sun or the moon, and they're not all parallel. There's a lot of lights down here, right? More local lights. So let's turn the sun off. The sun is off, and now it's dark outside. And let's add a well-drawn street light. Lovely. So when we think about the light coming from this street light, the terminators on between the light and shadow is really going to shift quite a bit. And we'll get something more like this. Now again, this is not perfect. I threw this together pretty quickly. But just to show you guys that the terminator is moving, it's making sure that it stays at 90 degrees, right? So like here's our 90 degrees, there's our 90 all the way down. So over here it's getting very, very oblong because this guy is all the way over here to the left side. So if you think about that light coming in, it's forming a right angle on him, and the lighting is different for every single one of these guys. Even though they're all standing in a straight line, they're all under the light, the way that you are going to represent that light on each person is going to be different. And the reason I'm making this point very clear is because I see a lot of work from beginners where they think, okay, the light's on the right, I'm going to color everyone the exact same way in the scene with the light from the right, even though the camera position means they need to be drawn differently or colored differently. All right, and to get away from the conceptual stuff here for just a second, I'll show you guys a picture of this in the real world. So this is a scene of these guys that are standing in formation, so they're all facing the same direction, and the light is coming from the same direction. But notice something interesting about this guy's face and this guy's face. Now, I can't zoom up on this and show you both of these guys at the same time, so I'm going to put them right next to each other. All right, so now here's the guy from the far right, and here's the guy from the far left. And you'll notice that we're seeing more of this side of this guy's face. So we're seeing more shadow. The shadow is kind of shaped like this here. And we're seeing less of the light side. Now on this guy over here, we're seeing more of the light side and less of the shadow side. So the main point that I want you guys to take away from this first part is just that number one, obviously you have to know where your light is, but number two, you have to know where the object you're lighting is in relation to where the viewer is and where the reader's eye is. Okay, so far we've covered light side, dark side, the terminator in between, and that makes sense, right? Hopefully. If not, leave a comment. We'll discuss. If you can wrap your head around this part, it'll take you a long way, because this kind of coloring is pretty common, actually. This is not realistic, but this is basically cell shading. You know, this is what you would find in anime, cartoons, some comics, where just you have light and shadow and that's it. But it's not particularly realistic, of course. Realistically, we usually have transitions that are kind of like this on a sphere. Now what I've done here is I've taken our light and I've put it directly above the sphere. So for the sake of this part of the lesson, consider the light source is directly overhead on our sphere. And when I was originally doing this lesson, I was talking about, light and how it bounces and photons, and honestly, it really felt very abstract, and I was like, this is a hard thing to kind of wrap your head around, a bouncing light, because we can't really see it that well, but we all understand a bouncing ball though, and so we're going to look at it this way. So let's say, forget the light for a second, let's say that we have one of those super balls, we used to call them when I was a kid, that are super bouncy, and you just let gravity take over and you drop this thing and it lands somewhere near the top of this sphere. Well, what's going to happen? It's going to bounce here, and it's going to bounce mostly back toward us, right? It's going to bounce here, and it might go a little bit this way. Unless you hit it directly head on, it's unlikely you'll probably get it to bounce straight back up, but it's going to bounce somewhere around here, right? Now, as we go down the sphere, what's going to happen? Okay, if I pull the sphere over to this side and I drop it, it's going to start mostly bouncing off in this direction, right? Or if I come over to this side and it hits here, it's going to kind of bounce out this way. Now, if I get right along the edges, where this curve is turning away from our light source, or from gravity in this case, and the ball comes down and it hits like here, it's mostly bouncing basically straight down, right? It's going to hit the side, and it might go down this way, or it might barely skim the edge and bounce off, but it's no longer bouncing back toward us, right? Anywhere once probably you get past about this point, it's going to start bouncing away. Okay, instead of bouncing back up. Light works the exact same way, okay? That's why this transition exists, is because as the light comes down and it starts getting closer and closer to this edge, less and less of that light is bouncing back into our eyeballs, okay? And that's how we see things, is the light bounces off the surface of the object and straight into the back of our eyes. So as the light comes down, you can see it's getting darker and darker because less and less of the light is bouncing back to us. But almost all of it is bouncing back up here at the top. So that's why this is so brightly lit. Now I'm talking about, there's actually two types of lighting we're going to discuss later. This is just a passive light, which is just when you're looking at this sphere, as you walk around it, none of these lights and shadows are going to move. There's another type called reflective. You think about the little bright lights on, billiard balls or snooker balls or whatever. That's not the kind of light we're talking about. We're just talking about the light that allows you to see the object, okay? So if we lose the ball for a second and think about this in terms of lighting, you can see most of it is bouncing back toward us, bouncing back toward the light. And as we go down the side of that sphere, you're seeing that angle start to change. And less of the light is starting to bounce to us, and more of it is just bouncing somewhere else. So that's how you get this really smooth gradient when the surface is curved like this. Because as this curve turns away from the light source, less and less of it is seen until you get to the point to where none of it is bouncing back at all because it's blocked by the sphere itself. So you end up with a terminator that comes across, something like this. Make this a little bit bigger. But you guys kind of get the idea. You've got a light side and a dark side, and that transition is just the difference between the brightest part of the image that you're doing and the darkest part. And understanding how to control this transition is what's really going to make your lighting look a lot better. Okay, and it's going to be more realistic. And even though realism is not always what we're going for in comics, it rarely is. But understanding these fundamentals of how things are realistically lit will make you a better colorist or make you better with color in general. And again, just a reminder, for this exercise, this is just a matte surface. It's not particularly shiny, it's not particularly rough. So I'm kind of taking all of that out of the equation for now. We will discuss that in a future video. So I was thinking, what in the real world would be a good example of how to talk about these transitions? Something that is relatively smooth, but not too smooth that it's shiny. We're not ready for that yet for this lesson. Or it's not too rough. And I'm like, well, marble statues, right? And museums have great lighting. So yes, marble statues, this would be a great example. So to go back to our red ball gravity bouncing analogy that we looked at earlier. So this transition, when there's a lot of space between the lightest part and the darkest part of some component, you're going to get that long transition. There's a lot of space and it's a very smooth curve, right? So anytime that you've got that smooth curve like this, you're going to get a long, smooth transition, right? And if you're confused about where the light parts of the images go, remember that bouncing ball analogy. And when the light's from the top, anyway, this is a little bit easier to follow. So the light's coming down, all the places that it's mostly bouncing back, that's going to be the bright part, okay? Now, if your light was at a different angle, you would just have to change gravity with your ball there for a second, but the same principles apply. So what determines the length of this transition? Like, when do you use a long soft transition like this, and when do you use a harder edge? How do you figure that out? This is how I think about this, and I don't know how other colorists do the mental math on this, but this is how I think about it anyway. So let's zoom up, and what I tend to think about is, number one, let's find the brightest parts of the image, okay? In the area that we're coloring. So on this guy's shoulder over here, the brightest part, now this is a pretty smooth gradient, so I would kind of have to make a judgment call, but the brightest part is right here, okay? And where is the darkest part? Well, the darkest part's down here, okay? Now, if this is one smooth curve in the middle, then I know my transition has to go from the lightest spot to the darkest spot. So it's a pretty long transition here. Finding that bright spot and the dark spot is very, very important because that's what's going to determine how long this transition is. So here's another example. We can see, here's how long it is here. But let's look at his pec muscle. And again, think about these shapes and the shapes of your own body and think about this. So the brightest part is actually, most of this is pretty bright, right? And the darkest part is where? It's right here. There's not a lot of space there, okay? There's very little space there, because if I were to make this a little smaller so this isn't too big, so like here's our light part, and then here's our darkest part, here's that terminator. Look at the distance. There's very little distance. I don't have room to do a big long transition here because the lightest spot and the darkest spot are very, very close to each other. Same thing here. This is all light. The darkest part's here. It's a very short transition. Now in other places on this image, let's back up a little bit, it's going to be even longer. You know, look at his, let's say his hip, for example. Now I'm thinking about this shape right here, and ignore the folds for right now. We're going to look at those folds in a second. But this part where his hip is kind of kicked out a little bit, it's catching a lot of light. So the brightest part is here. The darkest part, actually way down here, like under his knee almost. But really, the darkest part of this spot is all down way, all the way down here in this section. So again, look at the length of that transition. So when you're coloring, that would be like a first, kind of pass at that lighting through there. Is you could use your lasso and select that area, and then get a big bright soft brush. Let's see, what do I have here? Big soft brush, and do a very subtle light through there. Okay. Now, within this, we've got all these other little folds and things to consider. But look at each one of these. On each one, you have the brightest spot and the darkest spot. And again, look at that transition between the two. It's very, very short. And if you think about it, this fold's kind of coming up and around. It's kind of making this kind of, sorry, this is kind of hard to see, but it's making kind of this shape. Okay? So this little lip it's a very, very short transition through here from the lightest part to the darkest part. Here it's a little bit longer. Here's the bright part, here's the dark part. It's a little bit longer on this fold. And here's another example. This is, I don't know who this is. I thought I wrote it down. But in this example, if you want one more, because mixing harder edges with softer edges on these transitions is really what makes a drawing interesting. So look at something like his bicep. Again, very smooth curve, so we have a pretty smooth gradient from the lightest part to the darkest part. But if we go look at one of these folds, so like if the transition length here is, say, from here to here, light to dark, then look at the difference over here. I mean, this tiny little sliver of fabric here, here's the bright part, there's the dark part, that's a hard edge. That's when you would use a harder edge, is when that transition length is so short, you don't have room to do a transition there. So figure out the lightest part and the darkest part. That's going to determine how long the transition is. Now, some of you guys might be looking at this and you're wondering, well, actually, this is darkest right here, and then this is lighter again. Why is that happening? That's weird. Well, that's reflected light. That's going to be a different video, probably the next video. But what's happening is this light's coming down, and some of it, not very much of it, because we know that if we were to drop the ball at this angle, most of this stuff is going down here. But some of it is coming back. Okay, so it's bouncing off of this area. So the light's coming down and hitting the bottom side. That's all reflected light is. That's for another video. All right, so for this exercise, and I will put a link to this exercise in the description as well, so you guys can follow along or practice later. Probably be best just to watch first and then go back and practice later. So what I've done here is we've got some side views and top views of some curves that I want to demonstrate to you guys how the light would fall and how you would render these things. These are sort of, I think they're called orthographic views, but let's explain this real quick just in case anyone's not following what's happening here. So I'm going to mark this one as side and this one as top. And so if I were to draw this in like 3D perspective, and this is not going to be perfect, but think about it as being like a little block of wood or something. Kind of looks like this. And so this would be the side. And then this T down here on the top would actually kind of fit right there. Okay. So this is the side, this is the top of the same block. Okay. Now in my example, again, the light is going to be coming from the top. And so if we think about our bouncing ball analogy again, where all the places that most of it is coming back. Okay. If the light's directly above, then this whole little area here, most of it's coming back. And also where this kind of starts to flatten out. Most of these are going to be bouncing back. But along here, most of it is bouncing away, okay? So we're going to get less light reflecting off those areas. So if I were to, let's see, take this little dude right here, and I'm gonna go pick just white to keep this simple, and a soft brush, again, to keep this simple, then the light's gonna kind of fall right here, right? And at the very top, in the very middle, you might even, depending on how reflective the surface is, you're gonna get a little bit more light through there, okay? Something like this. And this gradient's not perfect, but it gets you going in the right direction. So then it's gonna, in this area, again, it's bouncing away mostly, so it's only gonna start to flatten out kind of in here. Okay, so it's gonna be something kind of like that. Now here's another more of an extreme example where we have this plane through here, which is facing almost completely away from us. And if that was the case, so again, thinking about our bouncing ball theory, most of this stuff at the top is bouncing up, but as we turn, it's going to start bouncing away until we get to here, and most of this isn't bouncing back at all. So this is going to be pretty dark if our only light source is from the top. This is going to be dark. And then it kind of fades back in. Most of this is going to reflect back up. So when I am coloring this, that's what I'm going to think about. So I'm going to go back to the top here. Again, I have my soft brush, and I'm just going to lay in a big bright color here. And then it gets kind of dark, and it gets dark, and it probably starts getting light again about right here. But this part here is going to be even darker. So I want to take this a little bit darker than I have the rest of them. This is probably a little too hard of a gradient, but I'm kind of doing this in real time on the fly. I actually did some of this earlier to save some time. Let's turn these off. This is the one that I put together a little bit earlier. So you can see that part where the light is coming down and it's mostly reflecting back. And then as we track this along the bottom, we can see that it's getting darker and darker and darker to the point that not very much is reflecting at all right here. And then it's fading back up toward light as we get into this flat part, okay? Two other quick examples here, and I've already done these ahead of time just for the sake of time. But here, I'm going to zoom up a little bit on this one. You'll notice that we've got soft transition, okay? Not a lot of distance there, so the transition's shorter. And then it comes to a hard corner, and then it's immediately going to be brighter again, right? So here we've got softer transition down to it stops, and then it's brighter again. And again, it's brighter, and it's getting darker along this edge to another hard edge where it's darkest, and then it's bright again. Okay, and then the last one here, this is just a flat surface. All this light's reflecting at the exact same angle, so that's all going to pretty much be one bright color if the light is coming from the sun or something. Now, if it was in the room closer to us, it will say it's a candlelight or something. You might get a slight fade off as it goes away. But when we're talking about sunlight, which we've been talking about today, it's all going to be pretty much one color. Now, I cheated a little bit here because in reality, you can see obviously that this would create a shadow in this area, okay? Because the light's going to be coming down, it's going to be blocked because of this little lip. But if the light was coming straight down, we wouldn't really see the shadow down here at all. So for this particular example, let's shift the light a little bit this direction because I wanted you guys to see that you would get a cast shadow there that's hard. Okay, the cast shadow edge is going to be hard because we're going directly from light, 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 no light as we come across here. And then we're back to our light going down and it kind of fades into a gradient. But these little cross sections you guys are seeing here, these cuts of these slices that we're taking across here, that's actually what you're doing when you're rendering, is you're deciding, all right, when the light slices through at this point, what parts are bright and what parts are dark. I'll show you what I mean. So as I was planning this video, again, I was trying to think of, what examples could I find that would show this concept of kind of slicing your objects along the way, because it's kind of a confusing thing to think about. I've never quite heard someone put it quite this way on YouTube. And I looked down, right next to me is a pillow next to my couch, and the light is directly above me. There's a ceiling fan right over my head, and I saw this. And so I took a picture because I'm like, this is what I want to talk to people about. So going back to the examples we talked about earlier, let's find the terminator. That's going to be important. What's separating the light and shadow? And then we'll look at the transition differences too on this pillow here. I'm going to do this with a really bright color so you guys can follow along. If I'm going to render this, number one, I want to find the terminator. Now that's the difference between the light and shadow. Now, of course, there's a little bit of guesswork in this, but we can kind of see that if we start over here on this side, we can see that the shadow kind of comes down like this. And then all of this is in shadow. I'm trying to find the edge, basically the top of the shadow. And then this kind of goes in like this. And this kind of goes like this. And then this is all kind of one big shape. And that goes up a little bit, something like that. So that's, we also have this little bit of thing down here that's catching some light too. But just so we don't confuse ourselves just yet, I'm gonna leave that one off. So everything below this is in shadow, and everything above it is catching some light. Going back to the bouncy ball theory, where are all the areas where the light is mostly reflecting back? Okay, so it's the brightest, and it's a little bit harder to do, but let's do a different color. Let's do red this time. But I'm basically tracing the bottom of the bright part, and it gets a little fuzzy through here, but kind of does this. And this comes down and down, and this kind of goes up, and it's not perfect, but you guys kind of get the idea. So everything above the red line is going to be lit. Now, how do you know when to use a soft edge and a hard edge? Look at the transitions again. If I lower the opacity on this a little bit so that we can see better, how much transition space do we have between the darkest part down here and the lightest part? That's the length of the transition, okay? So this is pretty long transitions through here. But look at what happens. I'm going to turn this off for a second. Look at what happens along this edge here. So we've kind of got this part of the pillow is folding, and it's almost crimped into like a wrinkle. Just like we talked about earlier, here's the brightest part, here's the darkest part. It's a very short transition. So where the transitions are that short, that's going to be a harder edge. You're going to have less, fuzziness, less of a transition in those areas. And I know this is a lot to take in, and I promise I'm going to tie this into some actual coloring here in a second. So how would I know how to recreate this if I needed to color this pillow? Every step along the way, you can think of it as kind of drawing one of those slices down the middle. I think I've set this up earlier, and I've hidden the other side just to make this a little bit easier. So if I take a slice of this pillow, okay, right down the middle of this area, and I want to draw this out just so you guys can visualize this, it's going to look something like this, okay? This is very, very subtle through here, but you can see, if I lower the opacity on this a little bit, you can see that it's bright here, gets a little bit darker, gets a little bit brighter. This part's a little bit brighter than this part. So this part's facing a little bit more up, and then this part turns back down again. So if I were to draw this from the side, at that point that I've made that slice there where it's red, it would look something like this, right? And this goes right into what we were talking about earlier with the bouncy ball. So all of this is bouncing up, we're seeing it, but over here at this angle, most of it's going away, and then it turns back up again, so we know this light's bouncing back up, and then it's bouncing away, and then all of this is away. And here, this is not even getting reached. And by the way, if you're wondering what these green lines are, I was basically marking the points where the transitions were happening. So here's a light shifting to dark, so I drew a straight line across to kind of help me to determine where to draw this. And then it turns again here to here, and then it turns for the last time here underneath. So I just kind of use these green lines as guidelines. You can probably see it on a better example here. Now I flip-flopped the image, but put it in the same place so you guys can track this with me. Light point, dark point. Now this, it gets a little bit lighter again from the reflective light, and it stops here, and then shadow, and then all of this is in shadow. So if we look at this as kind of a cross section again, this part of the pillow at this point looks like this, roughly. So light bouncing up, light bouncing away, and then the rest of it's in shadow. All right, so we have made it through all of the conceptual stuff, right? So now let's apply it. Let's actually use some of this stuff. I asked my friend and collaborator Max Dunbar. You guys have probably seen me coloring his big D&D group on the channel. I had him draw this guy for us, and I had him do something that made it a little bit hard for him. I asked him to not use any line weight changes, like any major line weight changes or any deep shadows, because I want you guys to be able to download this. There's a link in the description so that you can practice lighting him from any angle. Because there's no established light source for this scene. It can be anything that you want, okay? Or this guy, not this scene, I guess. Now, I have gone ahead and laid in some base colors just to give us something here to work with. And I've made the background pretty dark because I want you guys to, again, I want you to really be able to see the light here. And we'll start with something relatively simple, like his arm, for example. Now, what I'm going to do first, you guys don't necessarily have to do this, but I do think it would be a good exercise. And I want to tie in those spheres we've been talking about for however long this video is taking at this point, and apply that to a character. So starting with his right arm, and again, we'll just say the lights from the top to keep this consistent. I want you to picture kind of overlaying a mesh over this surface. Okay, this is going to help you to kind of visualize this. You know, the upper arm is pretty much a big cylinder, okay? And here's one side of it, and then here's the other side. It goes, of course, behind him. Over here on this arm, you know, this is going to be a big cylinder. So again, if the light is from the top, let's think about our bouncy ball again. Pretty much everything from, what, here above, it's probably going to catch light. So all of this area is going to be lit. So how would I do that? Let's turn this off. And I'm going to select his arm and this bit of armor here. Now, what I like to do when I'm rendering is to make as few selections as possible. If you want to force yourself to stay in the lines very simply, select the areas you want to color and then Control or Command J. That'll create a new layer and put the contents you've selected on that layer by itself. And then you take it one step further and lock the transparent pixels. Now, in order to do that in Photoshop, it's this little symbol right here. Okay, this little checkerboard symbol. In Procreate, it is called Alpha Lock, if you want to use Alpha Lock. But what this means is I can't color outside. If I turn it on, I can't color outside of this area. Okay, so it just makes things a little bit easier for us. So I'm going to zoom up here a little bit so you guys can see really well. And the first thing I'm going to do is think about the curves that are here. So this whole little area of armor, I guess this is kind of curved this way. Okay, this arm down here is curved this way. And again, we're kind of following that overall cylinder shape, right? And if you wanted to do the other arm too, you know, this arm kind of follows like this, okay? And then we got these lines going down if we wanted to create like a checkerboard. And even here, try to trace the shapes of these objects, okay? It's going to help you to understand later on when we get into more complex shapes. Being able to do these meshes are going to help you understand it a little bit better. All right, so we'll turn all that off, but that's how I want you guys to think about this. Always think in 3 dimensions, not 2. We're trying to create the 3D effect only in 2 dimensions, which means you have to think in 3 dimensions. So I'm going to sort of, if we're doing this soft transition effect I wanted to show you guys, so I'm just going to go get a color. It doesn't really matter what color. And a soft round brush because it doesn't matter which brush you use. And I'm just using white for now because it doesn't really matter. So I'm going to make a rough selection that kind of covers that area that I know the light's going to be. Okay, which is going to be about like that. Now, we haven't discussed cast shadows yet, but I think you guys can follow me here. This area here, in between, well, it's covered. It's covered by this other shape here. So I can actually remove this little area if I want, because it's casting a little bit of a shadow. The light's not going to be able to get under this, so I can remove it from there. If I want to get really fancy, I could even remove it maybe from that little sprig of hair there. Make a few cuts there where that light's going. And then just get my soft round brush, and I'm using white and soft transition. And you'll notice that I didn't go through the middle of my brush, okay? If you go right in the middle, you're kind of losing the ability to create that little fade effect there, okay? So what I did is I made the brush pretty much twice the size that I want to color and let that create the gradient for me. And you can kind of play around with the sizes until you get it exactly like you want. But I don't know, it's something about like that I think is pretty close. But now I have this nice subtle gradient across here, and that acts as a representation of the light we talked about earlier. And if I wanted to color this other arm over here, again, I'm looking at the angle that we're looking at this guy at, and we kind of have a low angle on him, okay? Our eyes are very low. They're probably at like his ankle level or his knee level. So we're kind of looking up at him. When you think about this arm here, well, what areas are facing the light? And it's going to kind of follow probably somewhere through here, right? And maybe I don't use quite as much light because, again, the angle is very different there. If we think about the ball bouncing again, here, very direct light, straight down. But here, this is kind of coming off at an angle, so I might use a little less of that light and make it not quite as bright. Now, the top of his fingers might be bright again, the top of his head would be bright, but these angles that are falling away from the light, like this arm over here, in the same lighting scenario, not going to be that bright. But one thing that'll help you to kind of do your first pass of lighting is to draw that mesh out on every single surface and really get to thinking about, is this facing up? Is it facing away? Is it somewhere in the middle? And I actually did this earlier just for the sake of time. And this isn't black magic. I don't want to overwhelm you guys with the whole thing at one time. So I'm going to paint in what I've already done. So even with shapes that are kind of rough and odd like this, like this bear claw or whatever this is here. If we think about the shapes here, you're going to get kind of three little humps, which is not that different from the exercise we looked at earlier. You know, on this cape, again, this is all going to curve this way. This part's curving this way. His arm, again, is kind of just a big cylinder. This is kind of a simple way of looking at all of this. It's a round shape, and you can see that it's curving away or it's not curving away from the light. But what if we want to get really detailed? I mean, we really want to get in there and see how to make sure that all those little reflections and shadows really look good. What do we have to do? Well, instead of thinking of the big broad shapes, like the example I just did where, you know, like his arm is just a big cylinder, let's look at this even closer. Okay, so let's get rid of all this for a second. Let's get really close to this guy's arm. Now, of course, it helps to have, you know, great line art with very solid forms. I'm going to make these lines really thin because I want to get really detailed on this one. When we're thinking about the shape of arms, and you can see what he's drawn in here, we've got the tricep muscle that comes in and kind of wraps around like this. We've got a big bicep here. You know, this area is pretty flat. And then we've got these muscles down here. This isn't going to be a full-on anatomy lesson, but this is stuff that you need to eventually figure out too. So if I want to draw a mesh on this, and let's say we're starting right here, and I'm just thinking about the underlying arm for now. So this is going to kind of curve around its bicep, and it kind of flattens out, and then the tricep comes up and around like that. We're thinking about that slice across there, right? And then this one's going to kind of come in, and again, it's going to come up, and then it goes down and around. And then there, this arm, this part kind of does this. And this all comes down to his elbow. And then if we think about the vertical lines, they're kind of running like this, right? But I want you guys to be able to visualize this stuff in 3 dimensions. And that's what I'm trying to get across here. You're not going to do this exactly right the first time you ever try. But I want you guys to get in the habit of really being able to feel out these little forms like this, because that's what's going to make the difference between, you know, crappy rendering and good rendering. And I'm gonna move this off of the surface here just so you guys can follow along as I color this here. First thing we need to figure out is where the light is. For the sake of the discussion here, I'm going to just put this light way behind him. Okay. So this light is kind of directly behind him at the angle he's sitting. So if he were to look left or right, he wouldn't be able to see it. It would be right behind him. So what does that mean exactly? That's going to mean that roughly half of his arm is going to be lit. Okay. I want you guys to always break every shape you look at, kind of separate it and just think about it separately for the sake of this discussion. We'll talk more later about cast shadows and all that stuff. So thinking about the forms that we have. So I'm going to kind of have a line that does something like this. And soft round brush. And I'm using kind of a yellow this time. And so my first pass, I'm just thinking generally about the whole shape. Okay, the whole arm in and of itself. Okay, now you could also paint this. There's no opposition to painting. If the lasso is strange, then just go get a brush. Doesn't really matter which one. And so I'm going to kind of paint in this side. And I want to lower the opacity on this. Yeah, so something like this, right? But now, if we get close, really close, and think about all of these shapes, think about that, pull this mesh in right next to us. So you see how on this little tricep here, this part faces the light, but this part's kind of starting to turn away, right? Because of this little shape over here. This muscle's kind of coming out and turning away. So I could remove the light or go grab the base skin color and paint some of this back in. Let me get on the right layer. There we go. Because that part's turned away from us, right? And then maybe even down up under here, under his arm, maybe we want to darken some of that. And again, looking back at our mesh, again, this part is sort of turning away. So maybe we want to paint some of this out a little bit more. I'm just picking my base color and just kind of lightly painting this in. But then in the parts where it humps back up on that direction, we can pull the light back in this way. Same thing on the bicep. Maybe we can color this in a little bit more now. But you can think of these horizontal lines as slices, just like we looked at that slice on the pillow. So if we were to cut a line around the bicep, around the tricep, just like that, then that's what's determining the difference between this part being light and this part being shadow. And you're just making that imaginary cut along all of these little surfaces. So here, it's a little bit flatter, okay? So this part, this dark shape, is now gone. And you can apply this to any part of this image, okay? And so if I get rid of all of this for a second, even something kind of as oddly shaped as like his shoulder pads are. If I come in here with my mesh again and think about these shapes, so I've got this big, mostly soft round shape. And this all kind of curves around his back. So where's the terminator? That's what we need to figure out first. Here's our light. The light's going to reach all this, we know. But where's that point where the light's not going to hit it? And where's the point where the light can no longer see, if we're thinking about that analogy again? If we are this light bulb and we're looking at this guy, at what point can we not see the surface? And it's going to be somewhere along here, probably. Okay, so all this is going to be lit, and all this is going to be in shadow. So if I wanted to apply this to an actual person that I was coloring, let's select all of this. And I actually have an action that will copy all of this to a new layer and lock the transparent pixels. So now I can come in here with my soft brush maybe, and start trying to figure out where this light goes. Something like this. Now, it's not all quite that simple because again, we should be thinking about this in 3 dimensions. What parts are we not going to be able to reach? And like with this bear claw that this guy is wearing as armor, sure, we have kind of a rough, round, spherical type shape there maybe, but break it up even further, just like we did the arm. And we actually have kind of these toes like this. So we have multiple little guys to color here. So instead, I can grab my base color and start filling some of this stuff in. And I'm doing this very quickly and rough just to show you guys. Lights might not reach under this little strap, so maybe I paint that away. And if you would prefer to use more of a lasso type technique, then I would pretty much trace along, what I would think would be the terminator, something like this. So now that I've drawn my rough area where the terminator goes, along that transition, I can start kind of cutting and adding to make it fit the piece better. So, actually I would say this toe is probably mostly going to be lit. So we can add that. I just hold down shift to add with the lasso. And then to remove, just Alt or Option to remove this side, because this side is going to be in shadow. Maybe I cut in some areas where the shadow isn't going to reach, or the light's not going to reach. And I can make it kind of fuzzy if I want to make it look more like fur. And then when I lay my light in, it follows that transition pretty well. This video is probably getting too long for YouTube attention spans, but I want to show you guys one more example. This exercise will also cure that issue that I see from a lot of beginners, which is just lighting everything in the middle, no matter what area that it's facing, no matter where it is. So if I take this guy section by section, I'm going to do this very quickly, because the point is not how I'm actually doing this, but I want you guys to get to thinking in the right direction here. Taking it section by section. So let's get most of like his upper body and back here. So if the light is directly above, like we'll use in this example, where is the ball more likely than not going to bounce back up? Okay, it's going to fall mostly in these areas, right? So all of this area up top, I'm being pretty rough with this, but that's fine. And these claws are kind of sticking out, so these would, of course, it would bounce back there. This part only of his cape, not the part that folds underneath. Maybe some of this. But what about this part of his arm? Maybe a little bit here, but not that much. We'll turn the opacity of this down some. Might catch just a little bit here. And this part's going to be pretty bright because it's facing up. This little area, that's going to be facing up. Pretty much all of this. Tops of his fingers, arms. We did this part earlier. You know, maybe a little bit on his knee here because, again, think about his arms blocking some of it, his head's blocking some of it. So I'm not just going to willy-nilly start lighting everything under here because it's not going to work that way. Most of this is not even going to be in direct light at all, this brown stuff, because the cape's in front of it and his arm's hanging over it. I mean, maybe we do a little bit over here or along that edge maybe. Probably just the back of his foot. Maybe the top of his foot here. But does that make sense now how you can't just light every part of every body with the same exact light, because it doesn't really work that way. And it looks strange if you do. Now this all makes a lot of sense when the light is coming from above or maybe even from the side. You can kind of wrap your head around it. But for those of you that you might be struggling with, what if it's lit from underneath, or this ball analogy falls apart when there's no gravity. If it helps you to understand it, then turn him upside down. Think about it that way. If he's lit from the top, quote unquote the bottom, this side's going to be lit. And this is all kind of at an angle, so I don't know how much of this is going to catch, but the edges of this is for sure under here. Top of his knee, top of this leg, some of this probably. Maybe just the edge along the bottom, the underside of this knife, the underside of this vial, this part of his face. All this is facing up. It's facing the light in at the angle we're looking at it now anyway. And then, the underside of his arm is actually going to be lit this time. And maybe some of this in here. So when you flip it over, it's like the ground is lit here, so this isn't a great example. But if it helps you to understand how the light's falling, then give it a shot. If the light's coming from the right, try switching it around like this. If this analogy's been useful for you, then that's something you could always do. Because sometimes it helps to look at things upside down. There's a very famous book on drawing. Is it drawing the right side of the brain or left side, or whichever one that is? Or I think the first exercise they have you do is draw an elephant and then draw him upside down. And if you draw him upside down, looking at him upside down, it's almost always better because you're not thinking about the shape of an elephant's leg anymore. You're thinking about the actual lines you're seeing on the page. As I was editing this, I realized there's one other point that I wanted to make for you guys, and you can kind of consider this maybe your homework toward the end if you want. I wanted to show you guys real quick on this piece that I did, and I don't know if the video is online for this yet or not, but I did a time lapse of this. Even on something as complicated as a face, these principles all still apply. Now this is not going to be a full-on, planes of the face video, but Adam Archer's work here is so strong and his forms are so good that I thought it would be a good example to show you guys how kind of working with that by drawing that mesh onto the drawings can really help you visualize it. Hopefully you guys can't hear the saw that's running outside. I apologize if you do. But so let's think about this in sections. So looking at her forehead area. So just taking this one section at a time and just looking at, say, her forehead first. Forehead's going to go round like this, right? And so thinking about our spheres from earlier, thinking about the ball from earlier, the brightest parts are at the top, right? Because we've got this sphere shape basically that keeps going up. And we're going to talk about this reflection light, this reflected light a little bit later, or reflective light, I believe it's called. But as we go down to the nose, so we've got bright, getting darker, darker, and then it gets bright again because it turns up. And even with noses, we've got these round shapes, right? We get on her cheek. This is kind of one plane that goes this way, but it's facing more up than down, so the light's being captured there. And as it turns, it's getting darker. And then even in this little spot here, this shape, this area kind of comes out. And then this kind of goes in like this. So once you get an understanding of how these meshes can help you to kind of wrap your head around some of these complex shapes, it'll make it a lot easier for you. Of course, the best exercise of all is to study real life. But what I've found is some people, real life is a little too real. Like it's, again, so far removed from what you actually want to do that if you don't know what you're looking at, then it can be a little difficult. So what I like to do is, look at it in movies. Movies are designed to be lit dramatically most of the time. Pixar movies are some of my favorite. This is shot from Infinity War, Avengers Infinity War. And just to make this a little bit more obvious, I'm going to pull up the levels and grab this left one and pull it toward the right to make this darker. I basically want to get rid of everything except the direct light, okay? And so even when you're watching movies, this is something that you can start looking for and start noticing. And now that you know what you're looking for, it'll be easier for you to find it. Or at least it has been for me. But, we've got these surfaces here curving away from the light. The light's, it's almost like a rim light almost. And so it's catching most of that here. And then as this goes across, it's getting darker. All of these little areas here, we've got a very short transition here from the light to the dark. So again, no big transition needed there. There's the bright part. There's the dark part. There's our transition. Noses, those are very sharp transitions because you don't get this big fade because there's no room for it. You've got to get from the brightest part to the darkest part very, very quickly. And there's also some cast shadows here. We haven't talked about cast shadows yet. That'll be different in another video. But those cast shadows are blocking us completely from those areas. So that's just something else for you guys to think about. And let's wrap this video up. All right, so this has been it's been a very big video that took me about, I don't know, I probably scripted this thing for 2 months off and on. We've really just scratched the surface of these concepts, and so this is going to be a new series that I'm doing on the channel. If you guys like this video, please let me know in the comments. And if you didn't, or if there are things you didn't understand, or if there are things that are unclear, let me know, because I want to put together sort of a follow-up to this one, because this one had so much information and way more than I usually try to put into one video. And I want to know what you guys think about this kind of video. I really do, because if you like them, I'm going to keep doing them. Well, I'm going to keep doing them regardless for these first few anyway, because there's a lot more to cover. We've really only covered direct light. That's really all we've talked about. We haven't talked about indirect light, what to do in the shadows, basically. We haven't talked about textures. We haven't talked about how to handle transitions specifically with different materials, all that sort of stuff. And so I want this to be a playlist on the channel that I can point people to when they ask, how do I know where the lights go? Or how do I know where to put the highlights? Or where do the highlights go? I can point them to this series and be like, well, here's the best place to start, at least from my perspective. I'm starting to see why I don't see a lot of people talking about this sort of stuff, because I've been researching this for a couple of months now and I have a stack of books. I'll put a picture over this so you guys can see what I mean. But trying to condense all this stuff down to a video or even a few videos to make sense of this it's been very hard. It's been something I've been working on for a while. So I hope that it's been successful. I hope you guys have learned something, but expect more like this, as we go forward. Because one thing that I've realized working on this is that, we all fall somewhere on the spectrum of, rank beginner that doesn't know anything, and, Michelangelo, the painter, not the Ninja Turtle. We're all somewhere on that spectrum, right? So I've done a lot of videos that are somewhere in the middle, and some that work toward getting faster, getting more efficient, or, whether it's certain layering techniques or blending modes or Photoshop trickery, whatever it is, Procreate tricks, whatever it is, that they'll make you faster, they'll make you more efficient, they'll, in some cases, make you a better colorist, I believe. But there's also the stuff that's in the other direction, which is what this video is, which is going more toward the fundamentals. What I've realized is that you really only get better going that direction, going more toward the fundamentals. Because I can give you all the actions and shortcuts and Photoshop magic stuff that or whatever. None of that stuff's going to make you better. It'll just make you more efficient and better in a production environment like comics or games or whatever. So this series, we're getting more advanced by getting more basic. So long story short, I want to do a lot more of these kind of videos. They take a long time, but I think they'll be worth it. And I hope you guys think so too. So be sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one. Leave a thumbs up on the video. Tell people about it. Tell your friends. Hopefully you guys pick something up here today. And check the links in the description. I will include links to the exercises that I use in the video, links to Max's drawing if you guys play around with. And there's also, I'll put a coupon code of my coloring courses in there that get into the storytelling aspects of being a colorist and go into more depth in those areas. And I think that's it. So thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.